Hi, I'm Brian, and this video is about the circulatory system. Today we'll be looking at the structures of the circulatory system and how those structures enable the system to carry out its major functions. So the major function of the circulatory system is to transport molecules around the body. These could be gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. They could be waste products like urea. They might be cells like white blood cells, red blood cells, hormones, antibodies, water. There's all kinds of things that need to be moved from one part of the body to somewhere else. And so the circulatory system basically acts like a highway system throughout the body. Down here I've got a picture of the state of Utah with the highway system marked on it, and there's a diagram of a person that has their arteries and veins marked on it, and you can kind of see some similarities in the way these things look. You've got arteries and veins that run, a few arteries and veins run throughout the body. What you don't see over here is the capillaries. These are the little tiny blood vessels that actually go through your tissues. In the same way, over here on the map of Utah, you see the major highways, but what you don't see is surface streets and on-ramps and off-ramps and that sort of thing. And there are some similarities as to their function, and we'll get to that in a little bit. One of the major structures of the circulatory system is blood, that fluid that's red that we all know of. Well, actually, blood is not fully red. The liquid part of the blood, which is called plasma, is sort of a yellowish liquid. It's mostly water, and it's given its yellowish tint because there's a whole bunch of nutrients and things dissolved in it. Things like salts and glucose, fats, vitamins, waste. There's all kinds of things that are dissolved in the plasma. So the function of plasma is primarily to carry substances dissolved in it. Another component of blood is white blood cells. Now, white blood cells are cells that are important in the immune system. So you see that the diagram down here on the bottom, there are a variety of different kinds of white blood cells. We've got monocytes, lymphocytes, neutrophils, basophils, and basically each of these different types of white blood cells has a specific function in fighting pathogens, a specific method by which they are able to fight pathogens and help your immune system. Another component of blood is platelets, which are small, like kind of cell fragments. They're cellular in that they have a cell membrane around them, but they don't have nuclei. They don't have most of the parts of a cell. But these are more like fragments of cells, and what they do is they form a meshwork over any damage to blood vessels. And so these things basically are the things that eventually will scab up, and they allow blood vessels to heal once they've been damaged. Red blood cells is the fourth component of blood, and these are cells that are sort of donut-shaped. You see them over here. They have a little dimple in the middle, and these are the cells that carry oxygen throughout the blood. They carry a little bit of carbon dioxide as well, but not too much. It's mostly for carrying oxygen. Now, the blood flows through the body in a closed circulatory system composed of the heart and blood vessels. Blood vessels, there are three major types. We've got arteries, and we've got veins. Those are the big ones over here, and you see an artery on the left side of this diagram and a vein on the right side of the diagram here. And you can see structurally they're sort of similar, but they have some really important differences. And the differences have to do with their function. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. So I'll draw a heart here. And the arteries are going to carry blood away from the heart. Veins, on the other hand, carry blood back to the heart. Okay, so if we come down this diagram here, what we've got, it's sort of an analogy. We've got a hose coming out of a hose bib, a faucet. And when you turn on this faucet, what's going to happen is the water is going to come pushing through this hose and go shooting out the far side over here. So we'd say that the water in this hose here is under high pressure. Well, this diagram at the bottom is exactly the same up to this point here. So when we turn on that faucet, this section of hose here is going to fill up and it's going to be under very high pressure. But what this hose now is hooked up to is a drip system, which is a series of small tubes that have a lot of friction. Because they're small, the water has to push through and it scrapes against the walls of the tubing, and so it causes friction. But they also have a lot of little nozzles that allow water to leak out. So there's a lot of leaking of the water in this section of the system here. And then that section ends and it connects to a larger hose over here. And so you can imagine if you were to turn the faucet on here, this first section of hose would be under high pressure. And then the water is going to start leaking out of this drip system here, and the water is going to have a lot of friction from the small tubing of the drip system. And so when the water collects after passing through that drip system, whatever water is left is going to collect in these large veins. It's going to be under very low pressure. And so instead of shooting out this side like it did in the top picture up here, this side the water is going to come drizzling out because it's under low pressure. And so that's sort of like the circulatory system. We've got arteries and veins and capillaries in between. And because of the setup, just like this analogy here, arteries are under very high pressure. You've got the heart pushing the blood through them, and so they're under very high pressure. Veins, on the other hand, have capillaries behind them, and capillaries leak blood out, they leak fluids out, and they're very small, so there's a lot of friction. The blood has a lot of friction going through them, and so the pressure in the veins is very low. So now we take that and look at our structure of arteries here. We see that arteries, one of the key differences between arteries and veins, is that arteries have a very thick layer of smooth muscle surrounding them. That's in part to help push the blood along, but also to help the artery from bursting under high pressure. Veins, because they're under low pressure, don't have much smooth muscle surrounding them, just a very thin layer, and that's about it. You also see the lumen, the space inside the blood vessel, for the vein is very large because it's carrying a large volume of blood. Arteries is relatively small, and again that's largely because this smooth muscle is so thick around it. Another key difference is if you imagine the heart pumping blood all the way down to your toes, by the time the blood has to come back up from your toes, it's coming in a vein, and it's working against gravity to get from your toes up to your heart. And there's very low pressure pushing the blood up, which means that the blood actually would be subject to gravity. It would flow downhill because of gravity. And so veins have these structures here. You got these valves in them. Arteries don't have those because they don't need them. Arteries will, the blood's going to go forward just because of the blood pressure pushing it forward. But because veins have low pressure, they need the valves to prevent backflow of blood. And in between the arteries and veins, you have branched arteries where they branch off and get smaller and smaller. These would be called arterioles. And these branches of veins would be called venules. If you add yoles or yoles to the end of words, it just means tiny or small. So these are small arteries and small veins. And they continue to branch and get smaller and smaller. And what you end up with in between them, connecting them, is this whole bed or a network of capillaries. Okay, so this network of capillaries consists of lots and lots and lots of little tiny blood vessels. These are typically so small that only one blood cell has to go through at a time. The blood cells have to go through it single file. And also the walls around the capillaries are super thin, generally only one cell thick. So they have very thin walls and they're very small. And structurally that's important because these are going to form a whole bed, a whole network through all of your tissues. So while there might be one major artery feeding blood to a muscle, there's going to be hundreds or thousands of these little tiny capillaries running through that muscle tissue itself. And all of those little capillaries will come together again to form veins, and you'll have one vein coming back from that muscle. So the tiny structure is important because it allows a whole network to run through your tissues, and the tiny thin walls are important because what capillaries do is they let molecules in and out. So to go back to our reference of the, referring to the circulatory system as a highway system, capillaries sort of act like the on-ramps and the off-ramps. They let stuff into and out of the blood. So for example, if you need to get nutrients from your digestive system, those nutrients will enter the blood in the capillaries surrounding the digestive tract, specifically the small intestine. And then they'll end up getting pumped back in through veins back to the heart, and then pumped out. Those nutrients will get pumped out to wherever they're needed in the body. So capillaries, they run through tissue. Another major structure of the circulatory system is the heart. The heart, you can see, has 4 chambers, and it's separated by a big wall. The 2 chambers on the left and the 2 chambers on the right are separated by a large wall here called the septum. Now these 2 chambers on the left and the 2 chambers on the right are basically like an individual pumps. The heart basically consists of 2 separate pumps. You've got the right atrium, top chamber on the right, and the left atrium, which is the top chamber on the left. Now it's kind of backwards from how it looks, but what you need to remember is that you're looking at this picture as if you're looking at it in somebody that's facing you. So this would be the right-hand side over here. So on the top part of the heart, the top 2 chambers, we have the atrium. The atria, plural for atrium is atria. And these are the receiving chambers of the heart. They receive blood coming back to the heart. Is that right? I guess that's right. Nope, it's not. I before E except after C. The bottom 2 chambers are the ventricles, and the ventricles are going to be the pumping chambers. Okay, so if the top chambers are the receiving chambers and the bottom chambers, the ventricles, are the pumping chambers, then we should see some structural differences in them that would allow them to carry out their functions, and sure enough we do. The atria, if you look at the thickness of the muscles surrounding them, it's very thin. All they're doing is receiving the blood, and so they have to have a little bit of give, and so smooth, thin layers of muscle there allows the atria to have a little bit of give to take in the blood that comes back to the heart. And then they only have to pump it about an inch to get it from the atria down to the ventricles. So they don't have to pump the blood very far, so they don't need very strong walls. The ventricles, on the other hand, being the pumping chambers, they've got to pump the blood possibly a long way. The right ventricle pumps blood out to the lungs, and that's about 6 or 8 inches, and so you can see they've got pretty thick walls. The left ventricle has to pump the blood all the way down to the toes and back up, which can be a distance of anywhere from 6 to 10 feet, depending on your height. So we're talking about pumping the blood a very long way, and so you can see right here, structurally, the left ventricle has a very thick wall around it, and that gives it the ability to put a lot of force in the blood and pump the blood a long way. Between the atria and the ventricles, there's a valve. So right here, this valve is called the tricuspid valve, and these valves are going to prevent backflow. So the atria is going to squeeze the blood down to the ventricle. When the ventricle squeezes the blood, we don't want the blood going backwards back up into the atria. We want the blood to get forced out through the blood vessel. And so this valve is going to close when the ventricle squeezes. That valve is going to snap shut. So the valve kind of looks like this. And when the ventricle squeezes, that valve is going to snap shut and prevent the blood from flowing backwards into the atria. And that's going to force the blood out through the blood vessel. So on the right-hand side, we've got a valve called the tricuspid valve. Tri, it means 3, and cusp means flap. So we've got a 3-flap valve. And on the left-hand side, we have the bicuspid valve, which is sometimes called the mitral valve. The bicuspid valve has, you can predict, 2 flaps. Bi means 2, and cusp is flap, so 2 flaps. Now the way you can remember which one is which is just take the tricuspid and rearrange tri, and you get right. So the tricuspid is on the right-hand side. If you can remember that, then you can just figure out that the left-hand side must be the bicuspid valve. So we look over here at the pathway of circulation, the pathway of blood flow through the body. And over here we've got the right atrium and the right ventricle. And over here we have the left atrium. Kind of hard to read there with the red. And over here is the left ventricle. Okay, now generally if you're going to outline the pathway of flow of blood through the body, then it's best to pick one place to start and always start at that spot because it makes it hard to get confused. So I always start at the left ventricle, and the reason I do this is because you can remember when you put your hand over your heart, generally people put it over the left side of their chest, and that's because it feels like your heart's on the left side. It's not, but the reason it feels that way is because the left ventricle is the one that's pumping the hardest. It's got to be able to pump blood all the way to your toes, and so it's the one that pumps the hardest. So that should allow you to remember that the left ventricle has to pump the blood all the way to the toes, or all throughout the body. So we're going to start there. So the left ventricle is going to squeeze blood, and this is oxygenated blood. It's got oxygen in it, and it's going to squeeze it out through a major blood vessel called the aorta. The aorta carries blood to the body. So all the blood that gets pumped out of the heart to the body goes through the aorta. The aorta branches, and some of the blood will go up to the arms and the head, basically everything above the heart, and some of the blood will go down to everything below the heart. So let's track the blood down below the heart. The aorta is going to continue down. It's going to branch off and form smaller arteries, like the renal artery, intestinal arteries, and so forth. And that blood is going to go through smaller and smaller branches, which are now in the order of arterioles. These arterioles here would lead to the kidneys, go through the kidneys. And then those arteries will eventually form a capillary bed in that particular organ. So we could be talking about capillary beds through the digestive tract, or through the liver, through the kidneys, through the muscles, that sort of thing. So the blood is going to go through capillary beds in the tissues, and at that point then it's going to be giving up things and getting things. It could be dropping off oxygen, dropping off glucose, picking up hormones, picking up waste, picking up carbon dioxide, that sort of thing. So that's where the exchange of stuff happens, is at the capillary level. Now those capillaries are going to come together again, form venules, and the venules come together and form veins, and they're all going to come back. All the blood is going to come back from the body in a very large vein, actually 2 very large veins, called the vena cava. So collectively they're called the vena cava. Now, just like the aorta is going to branch and send some blood up and some blood down, the vena cava is going to bring some blood from above and some blood from below the heart. And so we give them the name the inferior, which means below, and the superior vena cava. So the vena cava are going to empty the blood into the right atrium. Now think about what they've just done. This blood has given off all of its oxygen and picked up carbon dioxide. So the next thing it needs to do is it needs to go to the lungs, where it can drop off that carbon dioxide and be reoxygenated, pick up new oxygen. So the blood comes back in the vena cava, and we'll say from the body, to to the right atrium. The right atrium is going to pump the blood down past this valve, and hopefully you remember the name of this valve. It's on the right-hand side, so it's the tricuspid valve. Past that valve to the right ventricle. The right ventricle is going to squeeze the blood out through the artery here because it's going away from the heart, and that's the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary in Spanish, lungs is pulmones. Pulmonary means lungs. So this is the artery to the lungs. And interestingly, this is the only major artery in the body that carries deoxygenated blood. Most arteries carry oxygenated blood. So this artery, the pulmonary artery, is going to carry the blood to the lungs. In the lungs, that artery is going to branch off into smaller and smaller blood vessels, and eventually it gets to capillaries. Capillaries going through the lungs then are going to allow the carbon dioxide out of the blood and pick up oxygen. And now that blood, those capillaries are going to come back together and form what's called the pulmonary vein. And just like the artery, the pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood, the pulmonary vein is the only vein in the body that carries oxygenated blood. So this pulmonary vein is going to bring oxygenated blood back to the heart. It's going to drop the blood off in the left atria. Left atria will squeeze the blood down to the left ventricle, past the bicuspid valve, and now we're back to where we began. So that's how blood circulates through the body and where stuff is added to the blood along the way, these capillary beds. Hope that's helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to message me. Thanks.